The Supreme Court just told the President of the United States that he does not get to control global trade by himself, and while that might sound like a technical legal ruling about tariffs, it's actually one of those moments where the system quietly reasserts who is really allowed to hold power in this country. Because if you're just skimming the headlines, this looks like a Trump story, maybe even just another political win or loss depending on which side you're on. But that framing completely misses what actually is happening here, which is a much bigger reset around how far executive power is allowed to stretch before the rest of the system pulls it back. So here's what actually happened, and more importantly, what it changes. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Donald Trump went too far when he used emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs on imports from basically every major trading partner, arguing that while presidents do have some authority to regulate trade during genuine emergencies, the Constitution is still very clear that the power to impose taxes, which is exactly what tariffs are no matter how they're branded, belongs to Congress. And the way this was done matters because Trump relied on a 1977 law that was designed for situations where something sudden and extraordinary threatens the country, not as a flexible tool to reshape global trade policy whenever the White House decides the current setup isn't working. Now, to be fair, if you're sitting in the Oval Office, the appeal of that kind of tool is obvious because it's fast, it bypasses gridlock, and it lets you act without waiting for Congress to argue with itself for 6 months. But that's also exactly why the court stepped in. Because speed in government is usually just another word for concentrated power, and this is where the story gets more interesting than people are giving it credit for. This wasn't some predictable partisan split where one side backs Trump and the other doesn't, because the conservative majority court, including justices that Trump himself appointed, looked at this and essentially said, this isn't about whether tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea. This is about whether one person gets to unilaterally control a massive piece of the global economy just by labeling something an emergency. And if the answer had been yes, then what you're really doing is handing every future president a very convenient playbook where almost any economic issue can be reframed as urgent enough to justify bypassing Congress entirely. Trade imbalance becomes an emergency. Market instability sounds like an emergency. Political pressure becomes, you guessed it, say it with me, an emergency. Right, you're doing great. And once that door is open, it doesn't exactly close again. The version of this story that didn't happen because the court shut it down before it could fully solidify into precedent. But here's the part that makes this messier than a clean legal win or loss. The court very deliberately avoided answering what might be the most financially explosive question in the entire case, which is what happens to the massive amount of money that has already been collected under these tariffs. Because we're not talking about rounding errors here. We're talking about well over $100 billion that companies have already paid. And if those tariffs are now considered beyond the president's authority, then you immediately run into the uncomfortable follow-up, which is whether that money needs to be returned, and if so, how and to whom and on what timeline. Which is why even one of the dissenting justices basically acknowledged that unwinding this could turn into what he described as a mess. And that's probably the understatement of the year, because what you're really looking at now is a wave of lawsuits, companies lining up to try to reclaim billions, and the federal government trying to navigate a situation where there is no clean or easy resolution. So if you thought this ruling wrapped things up, it didn't. It just moved the fight into a different arena, one that's likely going to play out slowly, expensively, and very publicly. And at the same time, Trump has already made it clear that he's not going to shrug and move, because he's openly talking about finding alternative ways to reimpose tariffs using different legal authorities, which is exactly what you would expect, because presidents don't willingly give up tools that expand their power, especially when those tools let them act quickly and decisively on something as central as the economy. So the real takeaway here is that tariffs aren't over, or even that this specific policy is dead. It's that the method that was used got rejected, and now the next phase becomes figuring out a different path to get a very similar outcome. And this is where the mainstream narrative starts to fall apart a little bit, because you're going to hear this framed as a major loss for Trump. Which, sure, in a narrow sense, okay, it is. But that framing is also a little lazy, because it treats this like a political scoreboard moment instead of what it actually is, which is a structural boundary being reinforced. This isn't just about Trump, it's about every president who comes after him too. It's about whether the executive branch can slowly accumulate more control over time by stretching laws beyond their original intent, or whether there are still points where the system pushes back and says, no, this is where the line is. And in this case, the line is pretty simple. If you want to impose broad, sweeping tariffs that function as taxes on the entire global supply chain, you need Congress involved, even if that process is slower, messier, and, well, far less convenient, because that inconvenience is intentional. It's how the system prevents one person from making decisions that ripple across the entire economy without any real resistance. So when people say this slows things down, they're right, but they're missing the point. Because slowing things down is exactly how you prevent power from concentrating too quickly in one place. That's not a flaw, that's the design. This wasn't really about tariffs at all. It was the system stepping in to remind the president that there are still limits, even when speed and efficiency make it tempting to ignore them. And here's why this actually matters beyond this legal theory stuff, because the speed at which policy can change directly affects how stable or unstable everything around you becomes. From markets to businesses to supply chains, and eventually to the prices you see in Walmart every day. And what this decision just did was put a brake on how quickly one branch of the government can make those changes on its own, at least for now. Because if there's one pattern that shows up over and over again, it's that when power gets blocked in one place, it doesn't disappear, it just looks for another path. And that's exactly what's about to happen here as new legal strategies and policy angles and justifications start getting tested. So don't think of this as the end of story. It's not. Think of it as the system rejecting version 1. Version 2 coming to a theater to you soon, because that's how it always works. I'm Hank, here to explain the chaos, not hype it. If you want clarity instead of noise, you're in the right place.